Hello, class. I hope this finds you happy, healthy, safe, and sound. There were a couple questions about the Electoral College from the last lecture, and I wanted to touch on those and then go into Congress, which is our main topic. So, the Electoral College is very simply the way we elect presidents in the United States. There's essentially no other country on earth that does it the way that we do. So, if you want to write some of these down, this will help you understand the characteristics. So, first and foremost, there are two elections in the United States in terms of the president. There's a primary election, and then there's the actual presidential election. So, the primary, some people asked about this, say a Bernie Sanders, right? Where did he go? Well, he was running in the primary, and what if you don't know what that is? The primary is very simply the political party choosing their nominee. So, like the captain of your team, right? So, the Democrats, all the people who register as a Democrat across the country in various states, they vote for the candidate they like within the party, and then the party chooses almost always the person with the most votes, and that person goes on to go on November ballot to be there. On the other hand, so that's the primary election. The primary election is before the real election. It doesn't put you in office. The primary election is just the pre-game, if you will. Okay, so we're going to decide who's going to be our starting, since I'm a soccer football guy, who's going to be your starting medio, who's going to be your delantero, who's going to be your striker, who's going to be your midfielder. Um, does that make sense? So who's going to be your presidential nominee? For the Democrats this time, it was Biden, right? And the why aren't the Republicans doing a primary election this time? Why did only the Democrats, Bernie and Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris, before they all dropped out, and then ultimately Biden? But why didn't the Republicans do a primary? Well, because Trump's already the president and he's already the captain of the Republican Party, so to speak. So does that make sense? So if you get that, you'll really save you a lot of headache. And people say, "Oh, I voted for Bernie Sanders," and I say, "Oh, in the primary, well, who'd you vote for president?" "Oh, I voted for Bernie Sanders." There's only one way you could do that because Bernie Sanders isn't on the final ballot, right? He didn't make it, and I'm not trying to break any hearts here for Bernie supporters, right? But Hillary Clinton last time made it. So if you were to vote for Bernie Sanders, you were talking about the primary, right? When it was like Bernie versus Hillary Clinton last time, right? On the Democratic side. So you could, although you can write in a candidate, you can literally write in Daffy Duck if you want on the actual presidential ballot. Um, it's not going to do much, but so if you say you're a Sanders supporter, you have just think about it like this: you're you kind of now stuck because Sanders has gotten out of the race. You either have to choose: am I going to vote? Not vote, which that better not be an option for you. Maybe you'll vote Republican, which most probably wouldn't from that perspective. Or maybe you vote Biden because he's the closest to Bernie Sanders that's actually out there. Or maybe you vote Green Party or Libertarian. There's a lot of options, but here's what it comes down to. Once a person loses in the primary, they're not in the regular election, right? So when I say the regular election, it's the general election, and it's the first Tuesday of November this year, right? Or every 4 years. So the first Tuesday in November, now we get to the real presidential election. Okay, so this is where the Electoral College comes in. The Electoral College it's a little bit confusing, and if you find as you're listening that you're a little bit confused, that means it's probably making sense because it's a very unique way of electing a president. Okay, so most of you know the basics. If you don't, if you already do, forgive me for boring you, but if you don't, this will be really helpful. So first and foremost, there are total number of electoral votes that exist are 538. You might say, what does that number mean? Well, here's the good news. We're about to study Congress as part of this lecture. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some numbers and the numbers are of Congress. And once we add these numbers up, we're going to see that it's almost identical to the Electoral College. Okay, so if you're writing down notes, you've got the Electoral College in front of you here in your notes. Maybe skip over a page or go down a couple lines, and because this lecture bleeds into or overlaps with, a better way of saying it, Congress, right? And so in order to understand the electoral votes and why there are 538, that like, so all the people that voted in our country, 100 million people vote, and it only comes down to 538 electoral votes. And I'm going to explain all that. Where does that number come from? Why 538? Okay, so now skip down to your Congress part of your section. Here you go. First and foremost, here's the number you need to know. There are 100 U.S. senators. Okay, so 100 senators. Most of you all know that. So easy math. If we have 50 states, every state gets 2, right? Small states get 2, big states get 2. Everyone's equal in the Senate. Now, so that's 100 people. And what are we writing down? Now you're down in your Congress section, writing the number of people in Congress. So there's 2 chambers in Congress, right? You have the Senate, and then you have the House. The House has 435 people. 435. So one thing you'll notice immediately, it's way bigger, over 4 times the size of the Senate, and there's an odd number. 100 is an even number, 435 is an odd number. So if you want to know, so over here is the Senate, 100 people. Over here is the House, 435. In the 435, you would assume that there wouldn't be a tie, right? Because there's going to be an odd number. But over here in the Senate, it could be 50-50, right? And in that case, who breaks the tie? Some of you are already answering the screen. You're right if you said vice president. So not to pick on vice presidents, but constitutionally speaking, they have very, very little power. Their major power is if the Senate is a tie, 50-50, they get to come in and break that tie. Okay, so stay with me. Now we've got 100 senators, 435 people from the House. That's 535. But we said the number for the Electoral College was 538. So we're getting close, aren't we? Now this number is not just a random number anymore. So the total number of electors is 538, and the total number of people in Congress is 535. So where does the extra 3 come from? And this is a little quiz for you. What is the one place in America that's sort of bigger than a city or more important than any other city, but it's not a state either? And that's Washington, D.C., right? It's the capital of our country. You got to argue that it's maybe the most important city. Sorry to our lovely Long Beach, right? But does that kind of make sense? So here we go with D.C. having 3, Congress or the House and the Senate combined having 535 total. 100 in the Senate, 435. So that's 535. And then you add 3 for DC, because even though they're not a state, people live there, right? It's a populous, fairly populous place. So 3 votes for DC. Now here's a question that you should, if you have in your mind, write it down in your notes, the answer. A question that people often ask is there ever going to be more or less than 538 electoral votes? We should assume that no, that's never going to change. So wait, why 538 again? Well, because it's representing us the same way the Senate and the House do. So why first of all in the Senate is there 2 per state? Well, we made that simple mathematical understanding, right? Is that way it's equal, and the small states like New Jersey or Rhode Island get the same say in the law as the big states like California. But now here's where you need to pay attention, which is both the Electoral College and Congress. You can kind of learn about it once right now. So the 435, a big old circle, 435 that exists in the House of Representatives. Here's a couple things you need to know. First, in the Senate, you're there for 6 years, and then you run for re-election. If you're in the House, you run for 2 years and then re-election. So House is bigger. It's a little bit easier to get into. There's 435 spots. And on the Senate, it's obviously a little bit more difficult. there's only 100 spots, and every 6 years they get reelected, every two in the House. Now, coming back, why 435? Why that number? That well, here's more important than that. Let me ask the next question: is of the 435 that exists, in other words, there's 435 people in the House of Representatives. Who represents where? Who represents what? And how do we determine that? Because the Senate's really easy. Everyone gets two. That's easy, right? But we have 435. How do we determine that? And here's what you should write down. In the House of Representatives, it is all just like the Electoral College. It's based on population. Population, okay? So I'm not going to make you know many numbers this semester, but I want you to know a couple numbers right now. So first, we know 538. That's the total number of electoral votes that exist. That's the most. If you want everything, that would be 538 to 0, right? There are 535 people in Congress, Senate and House, plus the 3 for DC, and that's where we get that number 538. So it's not a random number. It's not. Now, one other number I want you to know, California, because I'm assuming you live in California if you're taking this class, right? So, and even if you don't, you got to know it. So California is the biggest state by far, population-wise. We have 55 electoral votes. But in order to understand how we got 55, you have to know this other term, and it's a really simple term. It's something you've probably gotten in the mail or an email about. It's called the census, CENSUS, the census. And the census is every 10 years, the United States government counts people who lives in the United States and where, right? Now, if you're worried like, oh my goodness, I don't want the government to know my information, they already know it. And it's not to keep track of you in that way. It's to represent you. So just to give you an idea, the census is actually a great thing for Americans or people who live in America, because the Supreme Court, first of all, knocked down a question that the Trump administration wanted to have, which was, are you a citizen? Supreme Court said you can't ask that. I'm trying not to take sides on much, but you could argue that's good news that you can't ask that, because now everyone who lives here will be represented and they won't be scared to answer the question honestly, right? So why do we have regardless of where you stand on that issue, why do we have a census? Is because the Constitution says every 10 years you got to count the people and where they live. So what if, say, millions of people moved out of California and they went to Arizona, and in 10 years we redid the census and we find that there's 2 million more people in Phoenix and 2 million less people in LA. Guess what's going to happen? Our 55 votes, they're going to get some of those votes. The 538 total number never changes. We just shuffle around who gets what. Does that make sense? Let's be more realistic. 2 million people moved to California because we're cool, and why wouldn't you want to move here, right? So 2 million people move here. Wherever they moved from, what if this combination? Those states are going to lose electoral votes and we're going to gain. So the 538 of the Electoral College is not a random number. It's based on the House, the Senate, which is Congress, plus 3 for DC. And is this making sense so far? I know you can't tell me yes or no directly, so write down any questions you have. So the Electoral College is set up this way, and now here's how you win. This is the last number I want you to know for this, and it's just really simple math if you look at it. 538, half of that would be 269. One more than half, meaning a majority, is 270. So here's the last number you need to know, at least for now. You need to win the presidency. The only number that matters is 270 electoral votes. Why? Because you're trying to win 538. That's like if you won every state, you win, and DC, you win 538. But you don't need to win that much. You just need to win half of that. Half is, one more than half. Half is 269. You need to win 270. Okay, so just so you know, if it were somehow 269, or there was another scenario where a third party got some and all candidates stayed below 270, guess what happens? The United States people, if it's a tie, we're done. We don't get to revote. The House of Representatives, who we've already voted for, gets to decide the president. So this 435 over here If it's a tie and no one gets to 270, they get to decide the president, and the Senate gets to decide the vice president. So it could be possible that, say, if this happened in 2012, the Republican House would have probably chose Romney to be president and Obama as the Senate, because the Democrats were in charge, would have been the vice president. How weird, right? These things, ties just don't happen. So it's just fun to know, in case, if you're wondering, if you're one of those people, well, what if? Now you know. Okay, so Electoral College, you all have already discovered the most important traits. Okay, there's the number, which is 538, our state, which is 55. You also know that in 10 years' time, those 55, or my home state of Virginia has 13, they can change if people move around, right? And then here's sort of the key to the Electoral College that makes it difficult for third parties, and in some cases makes it difficult for people to accept the results. Here's how Hillary Clinton or anyone could win 3 million more votes but lose the electoral vote. Okay, so just one more simple term. The Electoral College is when, our vote gets translated into the constitutional format that we've been describing, and it's a very arcane process. It's, we've been doing it for hundreds of years, versus what you and I know, which is just as a normal person, and this is what I want you to write down, the popular vote. It's literally just called the popular vote. You could call it the raw vote. Like if you eat raw vegetables or raw meat, it's something that's uncooked, untouched. The raw vote or the popular vote just means what? You and me going to vote. Normal people cast our ballot. Does your vote count? Of course it does. So here's what happens. They count, at the end of the day, everyone in California who's voted. In this case, last time, Hillary Clinton wins in California by roughly 2 million votes. Okay, so she blows out Trump in California. Now, if you're a Trump supporter, there were states where Trump blew out Hillary Clinton as well, like Texas and so forth. But coming back to California, so if Hillary Clinton wins in 2016, how many electoral votes does she win? So in other words, if she beats Trump in California like she did, this is the more important question. If she beats him by 2 million votes, popular, regular, you and I, raw votes, she wins by 2 million votes versus if she wins by 2 votes. Either way, she'll get 55 electoral votes. There's no other way. So here's what we're saying. And I said this last class, but this is what you can write down now if you didn't before, our last lecture. 96% of our states, so 48 out of 50, count the victor this way. If you win one more popular vote than the other person in the state, so just we go vote and we add it up, just normal, and Hillary Clinton or Trump has one more vote than the other, that winner gets all of that state's electoral votes. Wait, what if it was like 51 to 49%? 49% ain't good enough, you get nothing. So now stay with me. That's a harsh reality, right? But it's just the way it is. So the 2 states that don't do that are Maine and Nebraska. But to be honest, they're too small population-wise to have an impact on the election that would be big enough to change the result, at least so far. So most importantly now, you know that every state does, except for 2, does all or nothing for the winner. So now let's go back to Hillary Clinton, and people ask me this, and it's a great question. All of you that asked, how can you win by 2 million votes in a state, or 3 million votes total, and still lose? And here's why. Because she racked up a huge, huge victory in California. She won by 2 million something votes, right? Does she win more than 55 because of that? No. If she had beat him by 1 vote, she beat Trump by 1 vote, she still gets 55. If she beats him by 10 million votes, she gets 55. So she could run up the score. Does that make sense? You run up the score, all these people voting over here for her, but it still only translates to 55. So you might have these states where you dominate and the other person is, in this case, Trump had about 3 million less popular votes. But here's, if you're a Hillary Clinton fan, this is going to hurt. Here's the reason that Trump won is because he won the right states. What do I mean, the right states? The states that got him to 270. That's it. That's what the right states always mean. So one more thing about the states, and this will, I think, will really help, is you're going to notice if you've been paying attention to this, there are states like California where it's going to be a blowout. If I hate to disappoint you, if you're a Republican in California, your candidate as presidential candidate is going to lose. If you live in Alabama, if you live in Mississippi, or if you live in Texas, is changing, but still, if you're a Democrat, your candidate's going to lose. So I'm picking on both sides. I mean, there's states, right, where if you're a Republican or Democrat, you know your candidate's going to win or lose. California, it's not even close, right? It's not. It's statistically, it's a blowout. Um, so you might say to yourself, well, why vote? Well, I will say this much. It may feel like less of a vote because it's already such a big blowout, but your vote is still getting counted. So now I'm bringing you to this last part of the Electoral College, which is swing states. Swing states are very simply, you could also call them purple states. They're states, and purple comes from blue and red, right? Red is Republican, blue is Democrat. Purple states are states where neither, say, Trump or Clinton is ahead. It's like tied. It's a dead heat. It's 50-50 or 48-52 within the margin of error. It's a very close race. So what are we saying right now? We're saying there are some states that we call purple states or swing states. And these purple or swing states are where the presidential candidates are going to spend most of their time. It's a really simple reason why. Why wouldn't Trump come to California? Or why wouldn't Biden, for that matter, do, huge campaign rallies and stuff? They might do fundraisers, but they don't need to campaign in California because both of them already know the result. Biden is going to win California. Trump is going to win Texas. They're not going to waste time in those states. The states they're going to waste time in, if you will, are states where it's close, right? And then it's not wasting time at all to them. Where are they going to put the most commercials? They're going to put it in states where the race is close, right? Because think about this. If you were running a decathlon, which is the 10 different events at the Olympics, and if you're anything like me and you're like, hey, I'm not going to be able to beat these guys in a sprint, but I might be able to beat them in a long distance race. Would I give up? Would I rip my muscles and run until I vomit for a race that I'm going to finish 10th in? Or do I save my energy, jog that race? I'll still finish 10th, but I've got my muscles intact. I didn't waste money campaigning, right? I didn't get booed out of the state. See what I'm saying? So you're gonna save yourself for your best events. And in the same way, you're gonna save yourself for the best states. You're gonna save your money, your resources, your time for the best races. When I say best, I mean closest. The ones where if you could just get a 1 percentage point change, you might take that whole state, right? That is where candidates spend most of their time. So purple states include, but not limited to, Pennsylvania, not going in any particular order, Wisconsin, Michigan, and I would say the probably two biggest have to be Florida and Ohio. Florida's more famous about it, but Ohio, no candidate has won the White House in the last 80 years, Republican, without winning Ohio. So if you don't win Ohio, you're in for a bad night usually. Same with, these certain states, swing states like Florida as well, can determine the whole election because the other states may be blowout states, right? So just remember, if you're wondering why did Hillary Clinton win 3 million more and still lose, she racked up big victories in certain states like California, but you can still only get 55-0, right? So you win by 1 vote or you win by 2 million votes, you still get 55 and the person still gets 0. It doesn't change. So that's how that can happen. I hope that makes sense, and I hope you have a little better picture of the Electoral College now. Good. So I think what I'll do is move on now to Congress, and what we're going to just talk about is pick up where we left off just now, right? So we have 100 senators, and we have 435 people in the House of Representatives. So first, what I want you to know is this. I think we've already said this, but just make sure you have it down. The Senate is elected every 6 years. The House of Representatives is every 2 years. Okay. So what we're going to do now is just give you all a list of powers, constitutional powers that Congress has, and you'll see in this list how much power they have to affect your and my daily life, and really the life of the entire nation. Congress has. You could argue this for the president. You could also argue for the Supreme Court, and you could argue for each branch, but arguably the legislative branch, Congress, is the most powerful. Of course, they're all supposed to be equally powerful in their own way, right? But once I give you some of these, you might be surprised at some of the things that Congress is actually in charge of that you may not have known they were in charge of. Number one, in no particular order, Congress is in charge of declaring war. So if you are mad about a war or something that's a conflict that is actually a war, being mad at or angry at a president isn't necessarily appropriate. I mean, yeah, you can be mad at them and Congress because, look, the United States has been in 0 declared wars since World War II. What? Congress, in other words, let me say this. Congress hasn't officially declared war since World War II. Now, that's really sounds really confusing and doesn't make any sense. You just told me that Congress is the one that declares it. And I know we're in Iraq and Afghanistan. So here's what they do. They may not call it war. They'll call it something very similar. So like, and if you're a Joe Biden fan, I'm sorry, I might pick on him a little bit here, but I'm always trying to be even in my, so Joe Biden or any Republican that voted for the war. But when the Iraq war was about to be voted on, there was a question of should we just say we're waging war on the whole country of Iraq? Well, we're not really doing that, are we? We're going after one guy and his regime, Saddam Hussein, right? This dictator. So what Congress did and what they've done since World War II, Republican and Democrat alike, and I say Biden because he was actually one to vote on this. Trump wasn't in office to make a vote on it at the time. So Biden's going to catch some heat on this, but they voted to authorize the use of force in Iraq. Is that a war? Of course it is. Are people dying just like in a war? Yeah. Why wouldn't you just call it a war? Because if you're a politician, it gives you wiggle room. It gives you wiggle room. So you can say, I didn't know we were going to war. This is what Biden says now. I didn't really know we were going to war. I was misled by the president as to what I was actually authorizing. That might be a good answer if you're a politician, and it might be a great example of why we don't declare war, and we haven't since World War II, but yet we know Vietnam we had, and still you see veterans today as you drive by that went to the war in Vietnam. Is that not a war? We didn't technically declare it, but Congress gave the authority. Okay, so does that make sense? So they may play a word game, but they're declaring war in essence. Does that make sense? So here's what you could say in your notes under declaring war. Even though we haven't declared war as a nation since World War II officially, we've been in war. Vietnam, Korea, Desert Storm 91, Iraq, Afghanistan, right? Of course we've been in war. Of course we're in war. But regardless of whether we call it that or not, Congress has that authority to give the president the right to go to war. President can only do it for 90 days by him or herself, and then they're done. So 90 days, how long is the Vietnam War? Longer than 90 days. How long is basically the Afghanistan war has been going on for almost 19 years. So, I mean, this is, right? 90 days is nothing. Congress has the authority. So, boom, number one. Number two, Congress is in control of all federal money. So this is why I said it's going to surprise you how powerful Congress is. If you are a person, maybe like me before I knew, who says, oh, I love this president or I don't like this president because the economy was good or bad during their tenure. Have you ever, I don't know, I've heard people say things like this. Oh, I loved Bill Clinton because he was so good with the economy. The 90s, the economy was so good. Bill Clinton was a great president. And their connection is the economy was good, therefore the president did it. But what I'm teaching you right now is, and same if you said it with Trump before the coronavirus, if you were crediting him with the economy. But here's the reality for Bill Clinton, Trump, any of the presidents: Congress is in control of all of the money, all federal money. So we're talking $4 to $5 trillion of your tax dollars goes to Congress. And the president cannot spend a single cent of taxpayer dollar unless Congress has authorized it in some form or fashion, given it to the president. That's huge. That is huge. And that means that when you praise the president for a great economy, you're kind of misplacing the praise a bit. And if you're mad about taxes or the economy, you're misplaced. Now, obviously, as a president signs these things into law, he or she does have a huge part in pushing the legislation a certain way. But if you want to write this as number 3, what Congress does and what they pump out all the time is called legislation. And legislating is one of their priorities. It's one of their authorities. And what that means, just to want to put it really simply, is that they're writing bills that are potentially going to become law. What's the difference between a bill and a law? Only one thing: the president's signature. However, what if the president says, I don't like what Congress gave me? They gave me this bill for, whatever, spending money on this, and I just don't want to. Here's what the president can do. The president, and we'll learn this next lecture, the president can do something called veto, which means number 3 on our list, the Congress legislates, they give a bill to the president and they say, if you sign this, we'll be really happy and it'll become law immediately. The second you sign it, the president says, no, I won't sign it. What can Congress do? Here's the next thing for our notes. Ready? Congress can override the president's veto. Congress can override the president's veto. First, just make clear, what is a veto? The veto is when the president takes your bill instead of signing it and throws it in the trash, let's say, okay? Throws it in the trash, and then you as Congress go take it out of the trash, re-vote on it, and if you have a 2/3 majority, you have to have 2/3. If you have 67 senators or more and 67% of the House, then even though the president threw it in the trash and didn't sign it, it becomes law regardless. So is there a way, if the president, whoever it is, doesn't want to help Congress and doesn't want to, or just doesn't agree with it, is there a way, if the president says no to their legislation, for them to pass it anyway? Yes. And this is really important for the test, that you know this one part. It has to be 2/3 of the vote of House and Senate. And that's really hard to get. So statistically, you could say if the president's going to sign 100 bills, about one of them would be even in fear of a congressional override. In other words, about 99% of the time, the president signs a bill or vetoes it. 99% of the time, if the president vetoes a bill, it stays vetoed and never becomes a law. Why? Because the 2/3 is so hard to get people to agree on in Congress. 2/3 of Congress doesn't agree that the sky is blue or that grass is green. I know I always make that joke, but really, I mean, it's almost so to get 2/3 to agree would be a huge thing. So I'll give you an example, a great example, probably one of my favorites in history, of when Congress overrode the president's veto and got the law passed anyway. And it was none other than Richard Nixon. So he's the easy one to pick on, right? The only president essentially who was going to get impeached, and he just resigned because he's like, I don't want to. Here's what happens. Vietnam War era, right? And 1970s, Congress is getting a little bit upset that presidents are just getting into these incursions and these skirmishes and these wars, essentially, without really getting Congress's approval. And the Constitution says that Congress has the sole power to declare war. It's very clear. So guess what Congress did to Nixon? They said, we're going to make it even more specific. You only get, you being all presidents, only get 90 days. And actually, it's a little bit more strict than that. You get 60 days. This is the law right now, and it's called the War Powers Act. War Powers Act. The War Powers Act said this: President can only go to war for 60 days, or conflict, or whatever you want to call it, 60 days, and then you have 30 days to bring people home. So that's a total of 90 days. I don't mind if you just know the 90 day. 90 days, the president can go to war, and we already says most wars are in our lifetime have been decades long. Decades long. So 90 days is not that much. So what are we saying? Congress is, at the time, telling Nixon, here you go, sign this into law. We are going to limit your ability to wage war. Do you think that he signed it? Do you think he's like, yeah, I want to limit myself. Let's do it. Limitations all day long. No, he vetoed. He threw it in the trash. And guess what Congress did? They said, Republican, Democrat, I know we're different here. Let's come together on this. We have to make sure that presidents don't drag the country into war. This is the Congress's right. It's our right. So they got over 2/3 of the vote, and they passed it, even though Nixon didn't like it, even though he threw it in the trash, he vetoed it. Didn't matter. Congress overrode the veto and made it law without the president's signature. And that is the only way that can happen, is to that override. Otherwise, the president's got to sign it. Does that make sense? Awesome. Okay, now, this next one, we've got some really good characteristics here. This next one's really important, but it's just the Senate that can do this next thing, okay? So in the Senate only, the Senate is a little bit prestigious in this regard, right? We know that the House of Representatives can break a tie in a presidential election. That's huge. But the Senate gets to do something much more regularly, and that is this. And it's going to carry over to our next lecture, which I won't do too much. The president, when they come into office, gets to appoint a bunch of people. Sometimes they get to appoint Supreme Court justices. When does that happen? When out of the 9 justices, if someone dies or retires, then you get to put someone in. But whatever person you're putting in to whatever position it is at the federal level, it has to go through the Senate. Okay, so the Senate, remember, 100 people. And this, it's not 2/3. It's just you need a basic majority. So you need 51. Or if it was 50-50, sure, the vice president will come vote on your behalf, right? So say I'm the president or you're the president and you come in, let's say it's, the next president after Trump, whether Trump wins again or Biden wins, whoever it is, whenever we get another president, I can promise you that the next president is not going to want the same attorney general that's in there right now, the same secretary of defense. They're not going to want William Barr and Mark Esper. They're not going to want Trump's appointees in their administration, right? Why? Well, because they're not Trump. They're someone else. It's not even a slight. It would be the most normal thing in the world for a new president to come in and hire essentially an entirely new cabinet. And that doesn't mean where you put your snacks. The cabinet means, in this case, the group of national advisors and experts that you are going to ask the Senate to say, yes, I will put them in this position of power. So I'll give you a list of things. First, let's just deal with the Supreme Court one more time. The Supreme Court can only have someone added to it if a person that's on the court dies or retires. So if there are 9 people and the president comes in and no one has died or retired and the whole 4 years has gone by, guess what? That president didn't get to put anyone on the Supreme Court. Sorry, it's just the way it goes. Now, hypothetically, could all 9 people die or retire and the president gets put 9 on? It could happen. It's literally just, I'm going to say luck, but we don't know how many the president. So just so you know, if a president ever promises to put on a certain number, unless there's already a vacancy, that is just, I think hogwash is a good word for that. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. I hope that at least baseline of what we're saying here makes sense. So when you look at everything from Congress and the Senate, you see that, the House and the Senate, you see that the Senate is a little bit more powerful. So just to conclude here, president comes in, gets to put a cabinet in place. Supreme Court is unique. You don't automatically get to put someone on there. But the cabinet is your group of people that are your advisors. So again, the attorney general, basically the nation's top law enforcer, right? Then you have secretary of defense, We used to call it the Secretary of War. Why do you think that was changed? That was the Jeopardy. It was changed because Secretary of War sounds really pugnacious. If you don't know what that means aggressive, doesn't it? But if you say you're Secretary of, what do we call it now? Secretary of Defense, much more palatable. Palatable means easy to digest. So Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Treasury, the person that signs the dollar bills. It's pretty cool honor to have, right? Secretary of the Treasury, Department of Homeland Security, Housing and Urban Development, Health and Human Services. The list goes on and on and on and on. What I'm going to ask you on the test is really simple, okay? I'm going to say the Senate gets to do something special regarding presidential confirmations. What is it? Or presidential appointees. I just gave the answer. The president appoints someone, put it a little bit easier. The president appoints someone what happens next? And the answer is the president just doesn't get to just put someone wherever they want. The answer is the Senate has to vote yes or no. Does that person get to go in that position? And what those positions were the cabinet, remember, as well as the Supreme Court. Also, you could add to this head of the FBI, head of the CIA. These are huge, right? Head of ICE. These are huge and controversial. And depending on who you have in charge in those agencies, you're going to have a very different focus, right? I mean, just let me ask this question. You answer it on your own. Do you think the person that was in charge of ICE under President Obama may have a different outlook on enforcing, immigration law than, say, a Trump appointee would? I think it's a pretty obvious answer, right? Is that what we're saying is what? Whoever wins as president is going to put in the cabinet people that basically largely agree with them, right? Now, if a president's very wise, I would assume that they would put in voices where those voices may at times tell them, you know what you're thinking is actually not the best idea, and speak truth to power. That depends on the leader. That could get you fired real quick. I'm not going to take sides with Trump, but I will say there's been a remarkable turnover. And what that means is people haven't stayed very long in their positions under President Trump. And that technically constitutionally, now this is where it gets really interesting. Can President Trump, after these people have been put in these positions, the Senate votes, and he's got who he wants in positions, then he gets sick of them or doesn't like them, or they speak truth to him or speak up bad about him or whatever, and he just wants to get rid of them. What happens next? What is the does the Senate have to say, okay, we'll vote to see if they're gone? No. Here's kind of the final piece to this puzzle. The president has to ask the Senate to put that person officially in that position. But to get that person out, you don't have to ask the Senate. The president can just fire. That's it. So wait, yeah, that sucks. So if you're put in this position, it gets really scrutinized and it's really hard to get there because all the senators are going to ask you questions, or most of them will, about what you're going to do and your background, everything, right? And so that leaves, the Senate with not only more power, but with potentially some serious important decisions to make. But the bad thing is, once that person's in the position and they made this important decision, and they might like the person that the president put in, the Senate now has no power to control when or whether they're fired. No control. So the president can literally the next day be like, I know I just now, what's the one exception? I heard someone say it. The Supreme Court, exactly. The Supreme Court is the exception. You can't remove people from it. It doesn't matter if you don't like them. It doesn't matter if you tweet about them. It doesn't matter what you say. You cannot just remove a Supreme Court justice as a president. But you can fire the head of the FBI. It happened, right? James Comey, right when President Trump came in. These things can happen. The president technically has the power to do it. He could technically fire everyone other than the Supreme Court and just get new people constantly coming in. Obviously, that may have its own negative impact, but that's sort of where the law sides on that. So does that make sense for Congress? I mean, Congress has some big authority. And then if we want to add two more things to our list here for Congress, and then And I don't want to get too long of a lecture and get you too bored. But if you want to add two more things here, Congress is in charge of ratifying international treaties. Okay, so when President Obama, for example, made a treaty with Iran about nuclear capabilities and inspections and all this and that, the problem was that, for Obama anyway, that when Trump came into office, he immediately got us out of that treaty. He also got us out. Trump got us out of the Paris Climate Accord, which was something that Obama had negotiated the U.S. into, which was a essentially pollution, anti-global climate change initiative. Now, I'm going to just defend. I'm not saying I agree with it, but I'm trying to be objective. People who support not being in that treaty of why would you want more pollution? Well, they're not saying they want more. They're saying the U.S. this is what Trump's explanation was to get out of the treaty. The U.S. is going to be honest about how much we pollute, and we're going to pay the price for it. And then China or other countries are just going to cheat and pollute anyway. And since we live in a world where pollution and its effects travel, it's not going to do any good to be in this treaty. It's just going to hurt our economy. So just so you know, that's the sort of traditional Republican position on these types of treaties is first distrust of other countries actually doing it, and the worry that we'll be the only ones actually doing it, hurting our economy, making factories have harder standards and da 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 da. Whereas other countries will watch us enforce it and almost laugh. Now, if you're a liberal or Democrat, you're going to say it doesn't have to be that cynical. I'm not going to take a side, but Obama, and for a Democrat, obviously, we're going to say it is worth it. You know what? Even if there are cheaters in this world, in this new policy, any mitigation efforts that we do to slow down global climate change and pollution are going to be better than nothing, right? So those are the two sides. Hopefully, I try to do it as fairly as I can. The Iran treaty is another one. Just briefly, if you're wondering, Republicans are going to say Obama was naive to trust Iran and to ever make a treaty with them. Democrats are going to say, dude, you had a way to inspect Iranian nuclear facilities, and now you got out of that treaty, and now you can't go inspect them anymore. Republicans are going to say, yeah, but you really think they were letting us inspect the actual facilities where they're making the bomb? No, they were letting us inspect, greenhouse or something. I mean, the Republicans are going to say this. How can you trust the Iranian government is actually showing you the sites that it says it's showing you? They're just hiding those nuclear sites underground so they can build the bomb. Democrats are going to say, but by taking yourself out of the treaty, you have no way to verify that now. But here's all this conversation going back and forth is only there because of one thing, because the Congress did not ratify either of those treaties. So Obama got in. What is ratify? Ratify is just a fancy political science word for say it's law. We voted and it's law. Okay, so codified. Codified, member, it means being put into law. So that is a huge power that Congress has, is to make an international treaty like solid, unbreakable, official, right? And then last thing we'll say about Congress for today is that Congress is in charge of setting rules for international trade as well. So the president can do some things, but technically Congress is in charge of setting up the rules. So, for example, if there are sanctions against a country, Congress is. Here's an example of what I mean. For a long time, if you wanted to buy a Cuban cigar, you couldn't do so in the United States. And I'll tell you how I know. Because if anyone's still listening to this part in the lecture, I hope you like this story, because this really taught me something about trade policy. And it was actually, I never thought I was going to be learning a lesson. When I went to Jamaica in college with my college soccer team, and NCAA, every 4 years, you get to go on a trip to a foreign country or essentially to wherever you want to play the sport before your season starts. So in the preseason, we went to Jamaica. We played. It was amazing. My brother-in-law is from Jamaica. It's a glorious place. I loved it so much. And then we were there, right? And we're, 20 years old, 21, 19, whatever. And we see in Jamaica Cuban cigars. Now, we're all soccer players, we play football, we run all the time, corremos. But when you see a Cuban cigar, and I'm not saying I don't smoke, but you see a Cuban cigar and you're, in college, it's cool, dude. I want to bring it home. Why not? So I have it. So we weren't even going to smoke them. At least I know I wasn't. Last thing I want to do is smoke a big old cigar, but I just wanted to have it, right? I just wanted to have it. It said Cuban cigar. So I buy it in Jamaica. And my coach didn't even care because he knew I wasn't even going to smoke it, right? And we get on the plane and we fly back and we end up in Miami is the first place we land in the United States. So I went to school in Virginia, so we still have a little ways to go. I get there and I get randomly searched. So it's got to be the tattoos, right? Randomly search and they find that I have these Cuban cigars and I'm not even remotely worried because I'm like, it's tobacco and I'm not even gonna smoke it. I'm over 18, so and back then you only had to be 18. And so I know I sound so old, right? So the guy at Immigration's Customs Enforcement, or when you come in through a different country through the airport, they can inspect your stuff and ask you all kinds of questions, even if even if you've been gone for playing soccer for a couple months. And they find the cigars and they see that they're made in Cuba, and the guy just straight out just breaks them and throws them in the trash and just says, "What were you thinking?" And I'm like, "Wait, what?" And I just put two and two together. I'm like, wait a minute, I couldn't even buy a Cuban cigar in Jamaica and bring it home because the US at the time, I'm not that old, 2005 didn't have, 2004 when I went to Jamaica, didn't have, we didn't have trading relations with Cuba. So you couldn't, there was an embargo or sanctions, whatever the word you want to use. You weren't allowed to buy Cuban stuff. That type of change is up to Congress to make. So anyway, I hope this little wasn't too little. Medium sized lecture was informative. Any questions? Feel free to post, email, hit me up any way you can, and I will see you all soon for our next lecture on the presidency.